Hello, my name is Grace Inamorato. It's August 7th, 2023, and I will be presenting on the regulation of the gastric phase of digestion. So I understand things better personally by looking at the big picture first. So I wanted to briefly talk about the entirety of the digestion process so we can understand where the gastric phase fits in. The first phase is a cephalic phase, and cephalic actually means head. So we actually begin the digestive process before food is even in the mouth. Seeing, smelling, thinking about food will activate the medulla oblongata and send signals to activate digestion. One signal the medulla sends is along the vagus nerve to the stomach to begin the gastric phase. The three major functions of the gastric phase is storage, digestion, and defense. This is the phase that we will be discussing and taking a closer look at. The intestinal phase is where nutrients and water are absorbed into the body for metabolic uses. The first function of the stomach is to store food. So food travels down to the esophagus, and with the receptive relaxation, the stomach muscles relax and expand as the food drops in. The fundus, or upper stomach up here, is where the stomach holds food, and about 3.5 liters of food content enter the fundus per day. Digestion takes place in the lower stomach. Gastric motility is stimulated by distended walls of the stomach, and the gastric glands of the mucosa produce gastric acid. So as we can see over here, this is the gastric gland, and this is what produces gastric acid, which is an important chemical in digestion. Gastrin and histamine both stimulate the release of gastric acid from these glands. Gastrin is released in short, neural, and cephalic phases. The short reflexes. The short reflex, gastrin is stimulated by the presence of peptidase and distension. In the neural reflex, gastrin-releasing peptide, GRP, is released by the enteric nervous system, or the digestive nervous system. In the cephalic reflex, parasympathetic neurons from the vagus nerve stimulate G cells to release gastrin to blood. And they also indirectly stimulate the release of histamine. So histamine is secreted by enterochromatin-like cells, ELCs, in response to gastrin or acetylcholine from the nervous system. Histamine then targets the parietal cells at the H2 receptors to also stimulate gastric acid release. And then gastrin works directly on parietal cells to stimulate gastric acid release. So now that we know the biomechanics behind gastric acid secretion, why is gastric acid important in digestion? Gastric acid stimulates the release and activation of pepsin, which is a digestive enzyme that breaks down protein. Gastric acid stimulates somatostatin release as a negative feedback mechanism to inhibit gastric acid secretion when the end of digestion is near. Gastric acid sometimes can make the pH of the stomach as low as 1, which means that it has the ability to denature proteins. So it just unfolds the proteins and makes it more accessible for pepsin to digest. So it increases the surface area of these proteins, which is essentially what digestion is, increasing the surface area of the food bolus so that digestion can take place within the hole. The low pH also kills bacteria and inactivates salivary amylase, which was the start of digestion up in the mouth. Here we have a nice breakdown of what goes on inside a gastric gland. So here we can see the gastric gland again. This is within the rugae of the stomach over here. And as you can see, we have 7 cell types within a gastric gland. We have the mucus cells that produce mucus, and this acts as a physical barrier between the lumen and the epithelium. It also creates bicarbonate, which is a buffer for the gastric acid to prevent damage to the epithelium as well. The parietal cells further down right here secrete gastric acid and intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor reabsorbs vitamin B in the intestines. The chief cells down here secrete pepsin, which we spoke about already, and gastric lipase that helps break down fats. The ELCs over here release histamine, which we spoke about earlier. And then the D cells secrete somatostatin. Somatostatin is a hypothalamic inhibiting growth hormone that works by directly lowering gastrin, which then indirectly lowers histamine. Because as we remember, gastrin is released by the G cells down here and acts on the ELCs to release histamine. So somatostatin also somatostatin indirectly inhibits the release of histamine. Somatostatin also inhibits pepsinogen secretion from the chief cells. And then we have our little gastrin down here as our last secretion. The final function of the gastric phase is defense. There is the gastric phase reflex that is activated in the ENS by distension and pressure of peptides and amino acids. The mucus barrier produced by mucus cells protects the stomach against the acids that it is producing for digestion, and the bicarbonate acts as a buffer for the chemicals and the low pH. If these defenses fail, hyperacidity in the stomach destroys the protective mechanisms and causes peptic ulcers. Acid reflux into the esophagus can also happen, and this erodes the tissues there as well and can cause a change in the epithelium cell, which then can cause cancer. So here is my reference page. I wanted to say thank you for your time, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation.